This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome to today's presentation. In this presentation, I want to ask this question: does religion make people violent or abusive? And to begin, I want to talk about something that I observed in the Middle East, a very religious region of the world. Here is a picture of me years ago living and working in Baghdad during the Iraq War. This was in 2005 to 2006, a time of a lot of violence in that area. And in this picture, I'm standing in a zone called Crossed Swords. And it's a place where the former dictator Saddam Hussein used to hold military parades to celebrate his country's participation in violence. Now, looking at this picture, I want to focus on this area over here. Next to this arm holding a sword, if we zoom in, we see a structure that looks like a net. And out of that net are falling military helmets. And when I visited this place, we were told that these are the helmets of Iranian soldiers who were killed in the war between Iraq and Iran during the 1980s. It's very disturbing and macabre to see this kind of thing being celebrated with a monument. And I'm going to bring up the question, was this violence motivated by religion? Well, here's a picture of Saddam Hussein, a dictator who perpetrated a massive amount of violence during his lifetime. And here he is performing a prayer. Saddam Hussein sometimes found it necessary to have pictures taken of him performing devotional activities. And sometimes these pictures would be made into murals that were painted onto religious buildings. On a helicopter flight through Baghdad, there were several times where I passed by this building in particular, and it was an incredible sight to see. It's a giant Muslim mosque that Saddam Hussein wanted to build, and he wanted it to be bigger and more impressive than the Taj Mahal. It was an amazing building to see, but it has never been finished. Now, how does this relate to this question of religion and violence? Well, if you are a temple-going Latter-day Saint, you will probably understand this satanic triad. There are people like Saddam Hussein who exercise tyranny in the world. And a lot of times, their tyranny is funded through resource extraction. In the case of Saddam Hussein, he had plenty of treasure in the form of oil that was taken out of the earth. And with that, he funded violence. And he also used that money to fund religious teachers. Why would he do that? Because then he could claim that he had divine authority to exercise tyranny. Now, this is a system that we see all throughout history in so many different places. It is currently being implemented in some of the most violent areas of the world as we speak. So it is true that throughout history, religious people have used religion as a justification for all kinds of tyranny and cruelty. And that brings us to this question: does religion cause these tendencies? And if not, what should we think about the relationship between religion and horrible human behavior throughout history? And if we're going to ask that question, then first we need to define religion. A person's religion is whatever set of ideas orients them toward God or some transcendent ideal and toward other people. It is possible for two people to go to the same church and attend all of the same meetings and hear all of the same religious messaging in the context of church, yet have different religions. And this is something that is hard for critics of religion to understand. What they prefer to do is homogenize. And that is where we take things that are not the same and we try to make them the same or pretend that they are the same. In the context of this discussion, this is the fallacy of composition, where you say, if something is true of this part of this group, then it's true of all. And so in order to make an argument that religion causes a bad thing, you have to first pretend that when we are referring to a religion, we are referring to one thing. And this is what critics do, because it allows them to criticize institutions that they don't like. So as we define religion, I want to highly recommend an article written in the Deseret News a few years ago by Professor Robert George of Princeton University. He says, among the most risible phenomena of our times are the efforts of those who wish to retain the forms and symbols of the great historical traditions of religious faith, while recasting those traditions to bring them into line with the moral and political dogmas of expressive individualism and secular progressive ideology more generally. One finds this among Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant Christians, and Latter-day Saints, as well as among Jews, Muslims, and many others. It is, in a certain sense, poignant, though at the same time pathetic. At the end of the day, one's actual religion is a matter of what one actually believes, and how a person allows himself to be guided in the important dimensions of one's private and public lives. If a person is guided by the tenets of a secular ideology, be it of the left or right, be it expressive individualism, fascism, communism, or what have you, that ideology is one's true faith. Identifying as Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or Latter-day Saint is neither here nor there. Let's take a hypothetical example of what he's talking about. Let's consider the religions of Mike and Mark, and they attend the same church. Let's talk about their theology, what they believe about God. Well, Mike believes that God exists in the abstract. Mark believes that God is personally known. Mike's motive for church participation is belonging to a community. Mark's motive for church participation is conversion to Christ. Mike's epistemology, the process that he employs in a search for truth, is selectively quoting church authorities, whereas Mark's is a consensus of current church authorities, Scripture, and properly discerned personal revelation. Mike's expectations for the church are that the church exists to support political activism to transform society. Mark's expectations for the church are that the church brings people to Christ. Mike's understanding of the role of church leaders is that they are aligned with God's will whenever they hold the correct political views. Mark's understanding of the role of church leaders is that they are ordained of God and they are deserving of sustaining. Mike and Mark might go to the same church, but they have two very, very different religions. Now, let's imagine they don't go to the same church. If Mike were a member of my church, but Mark were Catholic, I would still have religiously more in common with Mark than with Mike. Sitting together in the same building for a period of time each week does not give two people the same religion. So let's think through two questions here. One, are there members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who have committed violence and abuse during the church's history? And the answer to that question, unfortunately, is yes. And let's follow up that question with another. Did their religion cause their behavior? And to get an answer to that, we have to talk about what a person's religion actually is. So that leads us to another question. What are the rates of violence and abuse among church members who are seeking real conversion to the gospel? They truly believe their religion. They attend their meetings. They sustain the prophets and seek to emulate their example in how they treat others. They are genuinely seeking to know Christ. They're serving the poor and needy, and they love the temple. There are very, very important distinctions that we need to consider when we talk about members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. First, let's think of the core, the mainstream of the church. People who believe the church's doctrines and believe in our sacred history and sustain their leaders and are seeking conversion. And then outside of the mainstream, there are some people who attend meetings alongside core members, but who are physically in, mentally out. They're non-believing, non-sustaining, and they're not seeking conversion. They go to church for other reasons. And then further out, we have fringe groups. These are people who have started or joined an apostate group, non-believing, non-sustaining, and they might be seeking to develop their new belief system and community as a rival to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then beyond that, we have people who are adjacent to the church. people who are inactive, non-attending, and former members of the church. Now, critics of the church try to pretend that this is all the same thing, and they give it the label Mormon. This is something that we see in documentaries and docudramas that discuss violent behavior on the part of people who have departed from the mainstream of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and in many cases are no longer members of the church at all. So why would a critic want to pretend that all of those religious experiences are the same thing? Well, if their personal agenda is to criticize the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then they're going to have powerful mental incentives to take dishonest shortcuts in their commentary about the church. Let's go back to another study in contrast between Mike and Mark. Let's pretend that Mike is an instructor for a class that teaches handling of hazardous materials, and Mark is someone who has passed Mike's class in handling of hazardous materials. So Mike says to Mark, "You have passed your exams and you are certified to handle hazardous materials." Mark replies and says, "But what if I find myself in a situation where I'm unclear about how to interpret a procedure in the handling of hazardous materials?" And Mike responds and says, "Look at examples of how I handle those situations." After all, Mike is an expert. He has been doing this for a long time. Now imagine that Mark says, "No, I think I'll disregard your guidance and just follow my own ideas of how to handle hazardous materials." And then Mark, in his construction work, causes an accidental fire that destroys a building. Now Mike has trained 5,000 people, and Mark is the only one of those 5,000 who has had a major safety incident. Does Mark's incident indicate a failure of Mike's training? Does Mark's incident indicate that there are problems with the regulations that Mike is teaching in his classes? Obviously not. When someone departs from a discipline, the discipline is not to blame for the outcome. That applies to the sciences, to construction work, and to our spiritual life as well. Now let's talk about a current case study, and it's a shocking and horrifying case. This is Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt. These are two women who were recently arrested and tried and sentenced to prison for child abuse. From what we know of this case, Jody Hildebrandt, the woman on the right, exerted a lot of manipulative control in her interactions with Ruby Franke. It was a very, very toxic relationship, like putting gasoline on fires in both directions. Now let's talk about some of the things that Ruby Franke said in her sentencing statement. She said, "For the past 4 years, I've chosen to follow counseling guidance," that is guidance from Jody Hildebrandt, "that has led me into a dark delusion. My distorted version of reality went largely unchecked, as I would isolate from anyone who challenged me. I was led to believe that this world was an evil place, filled with cops who control, hospitals that injure, government agencies that brainwash, church leaders who lie and lust, husbands who refuse to protect, and children who need to be abused. My choice to believe and behave this paranoia culminated into criminal activity." Now focus for a moment on what Ruby Franke said here. Jody Hildebrandt had led her to believe that church leaders lie and lust. So Jody was actually warping Ruby's views about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and sowing disillusionment so that she could pull her away from the church's teachings and help her to become dismissive of church leadership. Ruby continues, "Thank you to my bishop and my stake president for reminding me of the Lord's love for the lost. So much pain and suffering would have been avoided had I followed and heeded your counsel. I was the one who was deceived, not you." Again, let's focus here. She made specific decisions to disregard the counsel of church leaders. And this disregard of counsel of church leaders led her to abuse her own children. She goes on and says, "And finally, I'm sorry for twisting God's word and distorting his doctrines." Now, once again, Did she commit abuse as a result of her having participated in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Or did she commit abuse because she departed from the guidance that she had received in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? It's really important to understand that distinctions matter. Distinctions reflect reality, and people are motivated to participate in religious communities for different reasons. Some scriptural distinctions to consider are references to wheat and tares in the book of Matthew. These are two different kinds of plants that are growing together, but creating very, very different results. We have references to sheep and goats also in the book of Matthew. In the book of Mark, Jesus talks about hypocritical scribes and he denounces them. But in that same chapter, he says to a scribe who's with him, "Thou art not far from the kingdom of God." So even among subgroups like the scribes, there were people who were having very, very different experiences of religion. Now, in presentations on this channel, we often talk about the 3 temptations of Christ, where Satan tempted him in the wilderness. If we are consumed with the 3 temptations, we will bring those to our experience of religion. But conversely, if we are serious about our faith, then these bottomless pits will be filled. We will become fountains of living water. Our energy in the world will not be directed toward these things. So let's talk about another thing that we hear. The church should be able to prevent violence or abuse or whatever other bad thing. This is something that we often hear. Some criticisms take the form of, if the church is good, then its members will always behave well. Now, the church can and should use disciplinary measures in response to violent or abusive behavior of members, but the church cannot prevent violent and abusive people from acting on their impulses. No institution anywhere in the world can do that. The church cannot compel people to accept its teachings and follow the prophets in how they treat other people. Some of these criticisms are just using the church as a proxy target for complaints about the nature of reality itself. What I'm saying here is a lot of these complaints about what the church can and cannot do are just complaints about the world that we live in. But it's important to understand that religion is not the only context where violence happens in the world. When we talk about the opposite of religion, which is what we call secularism, there are few movements that embody secularism better than the French Revolution. And students of history will understand that the French Revolution was an explicitly anti-religious movement that promoted the worship of reason and was incredibly violent. It is regarded by historians as one of the most horrific and bloody times in modern civilization. The violence of the French Revolution was committed in the name of fairness and equality. And like most revolutions, it turned on its own during a period called the Reign of Terror. So looking beyond the French Revolution, consider these realities outside of religion. Historically, atheist movements and governments have perpetrated vastly more violence than religious movements and governments. Public schools, in the United States in particular, have astonishingly high amounts of violence, bullying, and abuse. And in light of these 2 facts, does atheism cause violence, or does public schooling make people violent and abusive? The answer to both of those questions is no. There are plenty of wonderful, peaceful atheists. And there are plenty of people who attend public schools, even violent public schools, without becoming violent as a result. So when people claim that religion causes violence, it's a claim without a basis. If you make a claim that System X makes people violent, and you want to have a basis for that claim, well, you would need to examine the group who participates in System X and the group who doesn't participate in System X. And then you would need to compare their rates of violent behavior. This would be the bare minimum of rigor in approaching this question. Now, if you wanted to make a broader claim that religion makes people violent, well, how would you determine that? One way to determine that would be to look at cities with high religious participation, and then also look at cities with low religious participation, and look at the rates of violent behavior in these 2 types of regions. Now, even more specific, do you think my church makes people violent? Well, in order to have a basis for that claim, you would need to examine a group who participates in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And here, let's make it easy and not even make distinctions between types of members who attend. But then you would compare that group against a group who doesn't participate in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And you would look at rates of violent behavior between these two groups. If you wanted to have a serious basis for that claim, this is the bare minimum of rigor that you would need to undertake in order to formulate a serious position. Now, if you are someone who wants to dig a little bit deeper into these kinds of questions, here's a resource that I recommend. It's a book called More God, Less Crime by Byron Johnson. He also has some podcast appearances as well. And in this book, he actually goes through lots and lots of social science research on this question, the relationship between religion and crime. Again, if you are actually serious about asking this question in a rigorous manner, this is a wonderful resource that brings together a huge body of social science studies. So recall at the beginning of this presentation, I gave an example of Saddam Hussein, the dictator, using religion to justify his horrible behavior. And I want to give you a couple of opposite examples now from the Middle East of religious people who do not use religion to justify bad behavior. And in fact, they use religion to become peacemakers in situations where conflict might even feel like a more natural response. The first example is from March 1997, where King Hussein of Jordan made a visit to Israel to meet with families of young people who were killed by a Jordanian terrorist. The article says the king knelt before each of the families in their separate homes as they sat on the floor in the Jewish custom for the 7-day mourning period. King Hussein was a peacemaker, and his peacemaking was an outgrowth of his approach to his religion. Here's another example. During the recent civil war in Syria, there were injured Syrians who needed treatment, and the only available place was in Israel, a nation who they considered to be hostile and dangerous. But many Syrians were brought into Israel for treatment, and their Israeli doctors did amazing things to help a lot of people. Here, Dr. Salman Zarqa says, "I've met many Syrians. When I met them at first, they were afraid to meet their enemy and receive medical support from us. They didn't always tell us the truth. We noticed that sometimes they changed their names, but things have changed. They have started smiling and speaking Hebrew. A number have told us that for many years, they have been educated that we are the devil and need to be kicked back to the sea. Now," he said, "they understand that we are more human than Assad, the president of Syria." He continues down below, "We offer not just treatment for their injuries, we treat them according to the Israeli standards. We do our best not just to try to save their lives, we try to improve the quality of their lives." Now, this is how this doctor and many other Israeli doctors responded to people who regarded Israel as their mortal enemy. And this is another example of where people's faith informed their decision to be peacemakers. So to reiterate, let's go back to two questions. Are there members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who have committed violence and abuse during the church's history? Yes. What are the rates of violence and abuse among church members who truly believe their religion, attend their meetings, sustain the prophets, and seek to emulate their example in how they treat others, are genuinely seeking to know Christ, are serving the poor and needy, and love the temple? I think the answer to this question is pretty obvious. This is not a fringe approach to our faith. This is the mainstream. And the rates of violence among members of the church who are living these mainstream ideals are probably close to nothing. So if you want to see more peaceful church members, promote authentic conversion to Christ and his gospel. And now let's close with some final thoughts. Religion does not make people violent or abusive. Neither do a lot of other things like public school attendance or employment, social activism, exposure to political ideologies, and any number of other life experiences of people who commit violence and abuse. When some people respond to life experiences by becoming violent and abusive, and yet other people with those same life experiences respond in a better way, we should explore why there are differences in responses, what choices and thought patterns enabled a person to respond well instead of poorly. And we should magnify the voices of people who respond well to things, so they can serve as models for others. And once again, I'm going to claim with plenty of evidence that you cannot find better models of how to interact with other people than the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is actually the productive way to approach these kinds of questions. And it doesn't just apply to faith communities. We should magnify the voices of good people in and out of our faith who model healthy and productive and peacemaking interactions with those around them. Thank you for joining me. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thanks again for joining us.